Hi, my name is Leesha, and I'm going to be giving you a quick overview of the progress that I have made this quarter on my project Nithya, which is about orchestrating research communities at scale and the training of research to undergrads. And we studied this in the DTR studio at Northwestern. So we started the DTR studio pretty small, where it was just a couple of undergrads that Hochi was training on how to lead independent research projects, where they're really leading the project from the beginning of the ideation process down to the writing of the paper manuscript. And the studio started out pretty small, and it kept growing and growing. And one of the things that we realized pretty quickly was that as the research group begins to expand in size, it becomes really difficult for the members of the community to identify the expertise within the community that's available to them when they're trying to overcome the challenges of doing research. And so, in that context, the mentors, like the faculty mentors and the graduate student mentors in the studio, end up spending additional time trying to provide this sort of ad hoc support as students are running into challenges. And with the volume of students, you can imagine that quickly becomes intractable without additional supports to help the faculty orchestrate the studio. And so we have the Agile Research Studio model, which was a pretty good start. It's a socio-technical system that really combines agile processes, these social structures, and then studio tools, virtual tools that we use within the studio to help us think about how to scale this really authentic independent research to up to 20 undergrads. And really by doing this, by distributing the support needed to achieve this work across the community. Um, so one of the things that we really saw was as the studio continues to grow beyond 20 students, the orchestration burdens actually continue to grow as well. So it becomes increasingly challenging to really coordinate all of the different support interactions that you're trying to distribute across the studio in a way that's really cognizant of the collective and individual needs that the students are experiencing and the resources that are available to those students. And the reason that it becomes difficult is, as you could imagine, when the community grows, the project goals, the challenges that the students encounter, the changing availability of the resources that are there for them are all changing and also kind of increasing in volume. So all of this introduces a ton of complexity into the system itself. And it becomes really difficult to think about how you might distribute it effectively. So just to get a little bit concrete here, these are some examples from some need finding that I've been doing over the past year or so of concrete examples, both from the student perspective and the faculty perspective of like, what does orchestration look like? Why is it hard to learn and to orchestrate learning in the studio? So from the student's perspective, it can be really difficult to understand who's the best person to go to for help on a specific challenge that I'm experiencing right now. And this is just a quote from one of the students where they're kind of reasoning about how to seek help based on something they need help on. And from the faculty perspective, there are these really interesting challenges around actually orchestrating that learning. So if students are trying to direct themselves in the studio over time, they're kind of trying to go through this process of self-direction. Faculty are trying to keep track of all of these students who are going through that self-direction process and recognize where each of these students at in this process and where are they getting stuck. And it becomes really difficult to do at scale. So this is an example quote from the faculty reflecting on this. So he said, "I don't have a sense of how close we are to the deadline and what the timeline looks like for each project. I don't remember where they're at, and I don't have a good sense of what each paper will look like exactly. It takes a lot of effort for me to do that on my own." And I think the key takeaway here is that it's the effort of doing that on their own. It takes a lot of mental effort for the faculty to be able to think about this and reason about this, not only for a single student, but imagining doing that at scale with many different projects going on at the same time. Another example of a faculty orchestration challenge is, given that I have limited time with my students, how do I best support them with that time? So there's a lot that the faculty is also thinking about in terms of how to mentor effectively. So for example, this is a quote where a faculty is thinking about what are the things that I need to think about as I'm mentoring. And they say, I want to reflect on what I think they need, what they think they need, and a way to know what's worth focusing on in our meetings. It's pretty difficult to do all that in my mind. So again, this is very much capturing that there's this burden that the faculty is facing by having to do this work on their own without any orchestration supports. So a lot of this has kind of led to a lot of the observations of these different challenges from both the student perspective and the faculty perspective led me to think about this question around how do we design systems that help us reason about the ways to best leverage a community that'll help us that'll help continually support us as we're making progress towards our goals. And like very specifically in this context, the community would be a learning community or the research studio, and supporting progress towards research progress and also personal growth progress. So it's interesting when you start to think about what are the decisions that students are trying to make in the context of the studio and what are the decisions that faculty are trying to make in the studio, and what context is necessary for them to start thinking about those decisions. And one of the things that I recognized pretty quickly was that all of this changing context within the studio is going to be informing the decisions that faculty are making in this learning community. So from the student perspective, they're really thinking about, okay, if I'm in this community, how do I self-direct my learning and really like guide my own work within the community? And when they're thinking about that, they might need to think about their own process timeline, their own changing state, so where are they at within that timeline, the different changing constraints that might affect the decisions that they make on that timeline. So maybe the way they act if there's 3 weeks to the deadline versus 3 days is very different. And then the available resources that can help them as they make progress. And from the faculty perspective, they're trying to keep track of all of these students going through this self-direction process. So based on the direction of many students, how are they meant to provide support effectively to those students, or how might they distribute it across the studio, and how do they think about that decision space? And the context that can kind of affect that is, well, each student might have different blockers, and those blockers are constantly changing on those projects. So what is sort of the state of the students' blockers? What are the ones that the studio or the faculty can't handle within the constraints of the studio? What are the ones that the community can actually handle and can be offloaded to the community? What are the ones that the faculty themselves really need to help focus on and provide help because they might have the expertise or the tacit knowledge to be able to help with those tasks specifically, and they might be the only ones who can help with those tasks. So for example, like conceptual guidance on a research contribution. And then what specific action should they be taking to guide students through the work? So like given that these are the things that they should focus on with students, how might they take action to help them as they make progress on that work? So at the beginning of the quarter, I started out by thinking through this design of a continual support system that it has a couple different phases, so I'll quickly walk through what the goals were of this. So if you look to the left side, there's this idea of being able to capture issues that the faculty is raising to students. So one of the things that we often see is that faculty will raise an issue to a student. The student might not understand all of like the background about why they should be doing this task or what the purpose is or what is really motivating that task, and because they might not have a full understanding of the task itself, they might misinterpret the task, and then they might go off and do the task and come back, and the faculty member kind of goes like, what happened? Like, this isn't what we talked about. And that type of situation will often happen. The other thing that often happens is that the student might not understand the task at all, and they might not attempt to change their original plan. So they might hear feedback from the faculty and then just go ahead and bulldoze through their previous plan because they didn't really understand or process what the feedback was, and then they'll come back and the faculty will go, well, this isn't what we talked about doing. Was like what happened to the takeaways that we talked about last time. So there's this issue of like alignment between what the actual issues are between the faculty and the student, but there's also this issue of given that you have alignment on those issues, how does the student actually incorporate that into their previous plans and come up with a new plan that they could then execute? So I was thinking about these different components that might help with that. So for example, what if a faculty might like have some reaction when they're thinking about feedback for a student, and what if the like a bot could help them articulate what the specific reasoning was, what risk it was related to in terms of the research, and then capture that issue and notify the student with it, and then like work with the student to make sure the student understands the issue as described by the faculty member, so that this try to get alignment between the faculty and the student. And then assuming that there's alignment, can the student then, if you, this is more on the right side now with the workspace, but can the student take this issue, and maybe there were many issues raised to them over the past week or so, can they look at their previous plan, take these issues and really think, okay, these are the changes that we might want to make, come up with a new plan, and then assuming that they have a new set of tasks that they want to do, how might they map that to the existing supports that are available to them? So for example, say they had SIG meeting on Tuesday and they got feedback on their arguments and they know that they're going to have a peer research opportunity on Friday. So they might be able to then think about, okay, if this is a support opportunity coming up, what is the work that I might want to do before that event so that I could kind of like set a goal for peer research and best utilize that time. And so I attempted a slice of that prototype this quarter by I was trying to think about if the if basically like where are faculty members already in this process of raising issues to students that students then need to incorporate into their plans, and it happens in the SIG meeting all the time. So students will come in, they'll get feedback on their plans and on their research, and faculty will sort of give them takeaways. So I tried to create a tracker that helps students capture those issues and then incorporate them into their plans. And so there's the spreadsheet that sort of just pulled in information from their canvases, and this is just like integrating all of the processes that we already do. So this is pulling from existing tools. But the goal was to really have students on the right side capture what the takeaways are from the actual meeting, and then on the left side, it's giving them context information about, okay, these are the things that the faculty raised. But like this was sort of like the high level goal of the sprint so far, just to remind you, so students don't go and like forget the previous things that they had already talked about. But the goal is really to incorporate and come up with a new plan that incorporates the takeaways, but doesn't completely trash the previous plan. And then there's a second part of the tool where after SIG meeting and kind of throughout the week, I just made a little bot that would take information from those spreadsheets and send out reminders to students on their projects as prompts to really help them stay aligned and on track with the plans that they had committed to. So assuming that they were aligned in the takeaways with the mentor, because they both wrote them down together in SIG meeting, could a bot help remind them to incorporate those takeaways into their plans if they haven't already, and sort of surface that in a project channel where both the mentor and the students are present. And these are just some example interactions of what I was beginning to see over like, I think I tested this for 2 weeks or so. So for example, the bot raised the current risks of the project. And this was just before a SIG meeting where they were about to plan, okay, given these risks, this is what the focus of our sprint should be. And prior to the SIG meeting, the mentor was able to see this and recognize, hey, this isn't the current risk that you should be focusing on. The current risk is actually to understand how to design this story tree for one of the tests that they want to do. So it was cool to see that it surfaced information that the mentor was able to respond to prior to SIG meeting. Now, there are some assumptions there too, like mentors might not always have time to respond to these before SIG meeting, for example. And the other example on the right side is taking the takeaways from the meeting and then reminding the students of that shortly after the meeting to really make sure. Because, so for example, in every SIG meeting, students will write down takeaways, but they don't necessarily say them out loud again back to the mentor, where they can do this kind of correction process. So this is an example of trying to do that online, where the bot says, okay, these are the takeaways that the students wrote down, and reminding the students of that and saying, have you updated your sprint stories to really incorporate these takeaways? And the mentor's actually catching right off the bat here at the shortly after the SIG meeting, as opposed to like waiting till the next SIG meeting or the next time they meet. And they're recognizing, hey, that first takeaway wasn't one of the core takeaways, and that this provides an opportunity for the mentor to check in outside of SIG meeting and surface information to the mentor. So this was just an example of like one of the prototypes that I was building this quarter, and I learned a lot from it, both in terms of what like this, how these types of interactions might be helping for the goals of getting alignment and helping students incorporate issues into their plans, but also in terms of just scoping down what the actual problem space is that I want to focus my designs on. So one of the things that I realized was a lot of these tools that I had, or a lot of the focus of the prototype that I had released was focused on helping the student execute this self-direction process, which isn't necessarily the goal. If you kind of think about it, I was like reflecting back and thinking what was the actual outcome I was hoping to see from that system, and I think it was something along the lines of I want students to remember to do these tasks, to remember to do the self-direction process, to remember, like, these are my takeaways. I need to update my sprint now. I need to record what I learned. I need to think about the next biggest risk in my project. And that isn't necessarily the goal of that could be a goal of a technology to design scaffolds to help students do that. But it isn't necessarily the goal that I want to be designing for right now. Because I think it kind of makes this assumption that students, that the goal of the technology is to help the students practice perfectly and to help them learn to self-direct. When in reality, that's going to happen by them making a ton of mistakes and the faculty being part of that loop where they're giving feedback to the students and helping correct them, where it's not a bot that's trying to replace the faculty, but a technology that surfaces information to the faculty where they can make decisions about how to mentor effectively or how the studio can support that mentoring more broadly. So it's actually less on the left side, the design space is less on the left side and less about how to help students self-direct and much more on the right side where it's about, if I'm a faculty member, how do I support the progress making of students at scale? And like, what are the decisions that I may be able to make, assuming that in practicing students are going to make mistakes and that's okay. So I kind of realized that, and this is just kind of another visualization, but like the design space is really here on the left side of, if I'm a faculty mentor, how do I actually orchestrate the studio? And less on, if I'm a student, how could I better self-direct within a studio? And so I spent a lot of the quarter kind of trying to answer these first couple of research questions and building understanding here. And I still have progress to make in these sections, but I'm really curious about, from a mentor perspective, what are some of the goals and strategies that mentors have when they're trying to think about, okay, what does it mean to orchestrate studio learning? And then from the literature, I started to build some knowledge around how the learning science literature thinks about problem-based learning, coaching, and mentoring, and what that looks like when you're trying to coach students through design problems, and what strategies might exist there, and scaffolds to support that. And then from the organizational behavior literature, there's a lot of interesting discussion about what do strategies look like for a leader when they're trying to support a team through a set of practices, and it's very process oriented, which is interesting. So I learned a lot about the breakdown of sort of what the process looks like for a leader to monitor the progress of many people in an organization, which was cool. And then once I have a sense of what these sort of existing strategies and goals are, I'm curious about how they break down, and in particular, how those strategies break down as we begin to scale. And beyond that, when we get a sense of these different breakdowns, which of the strategies that are breaking down require mentor input. So a lot of the decisions that faculty might make, so for example, um, get like hearing a student present and recognizing that there's some issue in their conceptual understanding of what the research contribution is, probably requires a research mentor's input or the faculty mentor's input, and is not something that you can necessarily automate. But there are strategy breakdowns that could probably be scripted into technical supports that are things that the faculty are just constantly doing all the time repeatedly in almost like this scripted way. And those could probably be offloaded into technology and really free up the faculty mentor's ability to focus on some of these mentoring strategies that do really require their expertise. And when we begin to think about um, what it looks like to sort of script these things, we could start to ask this question of how do you design systems that support that type of faculty mentor orchestration from this ecosystem perspective, where there's technology that can kind of help script and offload some of the parts that are very often repeated or um, just like regularly happening that don't necessarily require faculty mentor input, and what are the things that the faculty mentor really need to focus on. And so I've been trying to sort of characterize this and really hone in on what the design space is, and that's been a lot of my work this quarter. And yeah, I am excited to start thinking about in terms of the future research and next steps. I think in the upcoming quarters, I'm really excited about thinking about what an orchestration API might look like. So if we have all of this data on the DTR Studio and keeping track of student progress and the risks in their research and their sprint plans, for example, what would it look like to almost create an API where it's not just a bot that is like scripted to send out reminders, but it's a faculty mentor who can then write scripts based on this API to query for very specific information that they might want to understand, and almost like creating a scripting language for the studio. So I'm excited about that direction moving forward.